Faith is believing in something you can't see, you can't feel, something that can't be proven.
Then how do you know which is the right faith?
I think that's a gut thing.
I don't think about a right faith. I think about what resonates with me. I feel authentic. It brings me peace.
I think there is no absolute truth in any religion. I think it's a matter of subjective experience.
I kind of just trust my intuition, trust my gut.
You just know. You just gotta follow it.
You just gotta follow what you think is your faith.
If faith is blind, then what makes one belief better or worse than any other? And if it's just a leap in the dark, why should any of us feel obligated to believe anything at all? My name is Shane Rosenthal. I was raised in a Jewish home but became an atheist at a very young age. Later, as I began to question things, I ended up losing faith in my atheism and converted to Christianity. Since that time, I've never stopped asking questions, and I've spoken with authors and scholars from all over the world in order to explore the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives. Over the years, one thing I've concluded is this: we're all believers. But because there are so many conflicting ideas and worldviews out there, we just can't all be right. So how do we find the truth? On this podcast, we'll start by asking questions.
I'm really just trying to figure out what I believe right now.
Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Humble Skeptic Podcast. On the last two episodes, I discussed some of the amazing prophecies recorded in the book of Daniel. And over the same period, I've also written a series of articles connecting some of the themes and images from Daniel's prophecies to similar ideas found in the book of Revelation. Though at some point in the near future, I'd like to devote a program or two on the subject of John's apocalypse, since Easter is a little over a month away, I decided to change gears a bit by planning to release episodes related to the centrally important theme of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. The way I see it, if we want to understand the significance of Christ's atoning death, then we first need to go all the way back to the story of Exodus. After all, Jesus is presented in the Gospels as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, and he was put to death on the eve of Passover. According to Bart Ehrman, however, though the Israelite exodus from Egypt is a hugely significant event for all subsequent world history, it has proved difficult for biblical scholars to establish when these events took place. Bart Ehrman himself dates the Exodus to sometime around 1250 BC, and if this is indeed the case, then Ramesses II likely would have been the pharaoh Moses confronted. But Ehrman goes on to ask an important question. Quote, if according to the book of Exodus, Pharaoh and his entire army were destroyed in the sea, how is it that Egypt was still such a major military power afterwards? This, according to Ehrman, is, quote, a major problem, and it's not the only one. Biblical scholars have long identified a number of difficulties that the Exodus account presents, making it hard to think that everything happened as it is described in the book. In fact, Ehrman concludes, we may be dealing with legends, and not with objective historical facts, end quote. So then, in light of that perspective, what are we to make of the significance of Jesus' death? If he is presented in the New Testament as the ultimate Passover lamb who atones for sin and provides a worldwide redemption, what are we to conclude if the original Passover story itself was just a myth? Well, the implications of that view would frankly be devastating. You see, Jesus referred to Moses by name close to 20 times throughout the Gospels, and treated him as an authoritative historical figure whose words rightly served as the basis of Jewish law, life, and culture. In fact, he told the religious leaders of his own day that, quote, Moses wrote of me. Even more incredibly, the New Testament book of Jude makes the startling claim that Jesus was the one who saved his people from slavery when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. Therefore, if it's true that the Israelites never served as slaves in Egypt, and that the great story of the Exodus is rooted in mythology, this, of course, would destroy the very foundation of both Judaism and Christianity. But before we blindly adopt Bart Ehrman's perspective, it might be wise to consider an alternative point of view. On this program, you'll be hearing from Dr. David Rohl. If you've been listening to the show for some time, you may have heard some of my previous interviews with this famous Egyptologist who has challenged many of the scholarly assumptions about the ancient world. If you haven't heard those discussions, I'll provide links in the show notes. The first time I spoke with Dr. Rohl was back in 2020 which I then followed up with a second interview in 2021. In both of those conversations, Dr. Rohl presented some fascinating textual and archaeological evidence that corroborates the biblical story of the Exodus. And for this episode, I've edited both exchanges into a single flowing narrative. The primary focus of our conversations related to Dr. Rohl's fascinating book, Egypt, Myth or History. And when he agreed to record an interview with me, I decided to ask him how he first got interested in the subject of Egyptology.
It all started way back in the 1970s when I was looking at a very important book by a famous professor of Egyptology called Kenneth Kitchen. And this book had just come out, and it brought together all the information, all the data we had on a particular period of history in Egypt, which is the 21st to 25th dynasties. And I realized there was something very wrong with this book. The understandings that came out of reading it were that there were a lot of assumptions there that really weren't facts. And so it got me into the idea of looking at time and chronology and how Egypt related to other civilizations around the ancient world. And of course, one of the primary relationships is that we have in the Bible between Egypt and the Israelites. I realized there was something drastically wrong with Egyptian chronology, possibly as much as 300 years out it was. And so having realigned it and worked on the Egyptian material, I then came to the conclusion that the synchronisms between the Bible and Egypt were much better with this new chronology than they were previously, because there were no real connections that we had previously with the conventional dating scheme that came from Egypt. So it was a real eye-opener, and it led me to 35 years of research, maybe nearly up to 40 now. So I've been at it a fair while.
Tell our listeners how you got interested in Egyptology to begin with, and then what were some of the anomalies that you discovered in that field that ended up motivating you to create that new chronology?
Sure. Well, my interest in Egyptology started when I was 7 years old. I mean, I was writing hieroglyphs, the names of the kings of Egypt from the 1st to 30th dynasty at 7, in hieroglyphs, in Greek and in English, the translation. So it goes back a long way. Don't ask me why, but that was the case. So I've been interested in the land of the pharaohs all my life, practically.
I think I saw a documentary once where you were featured, you were telling your life story, and there was a child acting your part, and your shadow was being cast into the tomb of this ancient Egyptian mausoleum or something.
That was rather a strange experience, actually, because the producers who made the documentary actually decided to use actors to play my parts rather than me. And it's very rare for somebody still to be alive when that happens. It's usually when you're long dead that you get that privilege. So it was quite a strange thing to experience watching that with, as you say, a young boy telling the story, and then, of course, a mature actor doing me at university, etc. So it was a very strange thing. But it told the story correctly, I suppose. Yes, I got into Egyptology very early on. Then I went into the music industry for about 25, 30 years. And then when I'd made lots of money as a record producer, I went back to university for the second time to study Egyptology properly, because I'd had that love all the way through my life, and went on to do a PhD. So I've been involved in Egyptology the whole life, and I've studied it at university within the academic setting.
What were some of the rock bands you produced back in the day?
I worked on a lot of UK bands, which you probably won't know very much of. But I mean, some of the artists I worked on from America, if I can remember rightly, is have you heard of Trudy Lopez? If I Had a Hammer, do you remember that?
Yeah.
That goes back a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah.
10cc, if you know them, they're an English band. I was the photographer for the Moody Blues for a few years in the early 70s. Nazareth, I don't know if you know them, the rock band. Yeah. Thin Lizzy. It's coming back to me now, but there's quite a few more.
So after some time in the music industry, you earned enough money to go back to your real love, which was Egyptology. So you spent some time in there. So what were some of those initial anomalies that helped you realize things were amiss in your own reckoning?
Well, it's all about the way that the Egyptologists reconstruct the timeline of a very, very difficult period. It's the period of Egyptian history which even students don't go into. Professors don't teach it because it's so complex.
Yeah.
And it's basically after the collapse of the New Kingdom, the great pharaohs like Ramesses II, etc. And we get into this sort of dark age period before we get to what we would probably call the late period or classical period. And it's dynasties 21 to 25. They're the ones that are the problematic ones. ones. And they're a big mess. They're a quagmire of data that doesn't quite fit together, and we have holes in the data that we can't join things up together properly. And it seemed to me that it was easy for the Egyptologists to spread out the period and fit in all these bits of data into a big space than try to compress it down to what it might be in reality, because some of the gaps that were forming there didn't make any sense. So what I did was I took that all together and I undid the whole thing and replaced these kings as tightly as possible within that framework, these 5 dynasties. And it looked like at least around 160 years had been added in falsely into the timeline by the Egyptologists over the last 100 years. And in fact, there's more time coming out from an earlier period. So that was the first clue that something was wrong. And then when I looked towards the biblical world, and everybody's been saying this for donkey's years now, there didn't seem to be any matches, any synchronisms, any way that you could compare Egyptian history to biblical history. But with these timelines being shortened and reduced, we end up with synchronisms which make absolute sense with the archaeology of the Levant and the Holy Land, with the archaeology of Egypt and the Delta in terms of the Joseph story and the Exodus. All those things seem to fit much better with this shortened timeline. The synchronisms seem to fit beautifully.
And you didn't go into that field of trying to find synchronisms between Egyptology and the Bible based on any kind of Christian conviction, right? That was just something you discovered later, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that wasn't my interest at all.
Yeah.
My interest was trying to solve the Egyptian problem. And having done so, the obvious thing to go for next was to look outside Egypt and see how the new timeline affected all these other civilizations. And the nearest neighbor to Egypt is Israel.
Yeah. How was your new chronology initially received by the wider community of historians and Egyptologists?
Not very well. It's the usual story. It's very difficult to change a paradigm. It's very hard to convince people who've studied the subject and taught the subject for all their lives, explaining away Dark Ages, etc. Their careers have been based on all this. And then some young buck comes along who's been in the music industry for 25 years and says, hang on a minute, there's something not quite right here. What about this idea? And of course, it's very difficult for people who've been teaching at university for 30 or 40 years to change their minds. However, the younger Egyptologists, different matter. My colleagues at university, my student colleagues, my PhD colleagues, they were fascinated by the whole thing. And we used to have seminars at university with all the PhD students and the professors, in my particular case, at my university, which is University College London, all chiming in and discussing all this. It's outside that environment with people who don't know me and don't know the research in depth, who are the critics.
Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions comes to mind.
Yeah, well, exactly. There's a few others as well. I think there's the famous one about you have to wait till one generation of scholars die out before a new generation comes along to accept a great idea.
Have you found that there's maybe a little bit more movement in recent years with regard to the old guard?
Well, I think so. I mean, even my nemesis, Professor Kenneth Kitchen, who originally said that I was 98% rubbish, he's now admitted in a debate that we had in University of Reading a few years back that the new chronology, or the David Rohl Exodus date, is as powerful and as strong as his own view about the Ramesses Exodus date. So, there's somebody who was absolutely dismissive of it coming along and saying, well, there's some strength to this.
Yeah. Now, for the purposes of this program, I'd like to primarily talk to you about your book, Exodus, Myth or History. But before we dive into some of the details of your research in that book, I'd like you to interact with a few quotes from some respected archaeologists. For example, Zeev Herzog writes that the Israelites were never in Egypt. Most people would agree this is legendary and not a historical event. Norma Franklin says, I don't believe that there was a single event that we can call the Exodus, archaeologically or historically. And then Israel Finkelstein says, when we try to read the Exodus on the background of the 13th century BC, it simply doesn't work because there is no archaeological evidence. So, David Rohl, how do you respond to assertions of those kinds?
Well, all three of them are right. They're right because when they look at the 12th century, the 13th century, the 1250 BC date, the so-called Ramesses Exodus date, there is no evidence. Their problem is they're not looking in the right timeline. They're not looking in the right place in time, history. But with the new chronology dating, we do find evidence for the conquest. And before that, we find evidence for a massive population of Israelites in Goshen and the Eastern Delta in the centuries before that date, which would be fitting the sojourn period of the Bible.
Now, those historians who do believe that there is some kind of historical basis for the Exodus typically argue that Ramesses must have been the pharaoh who reigned during the time of Moses. What's that conviction based on, and what are some of your reasons for challenging that assumption?
It's based solely on one passage in Exodus, the first chapter of Exodus, where it talks about the Israelites building the store cities of Ramses and Pithom. And that's all it's based on, nothing else. But if you think about it, Joseph settled his father Jacob in the land of Ramesses. Okay, now Jacob cannot be at the time of Ramesses because they're hundreds of years earlier. So it's obviously an updating that we have in the text where somebody's updated the location to give the name of the place as it was in the time of the update. Somebody has written down the name of the place as it was then, which was called Ramesses. But the earlier name of the place, if we go back and we look under that city archaeologically, there's an older place called Avaris, and that's the one where we have a massive population of Semitic peoples.
So it's basically like someone referring to London rather than Londinium. They're updating it for the modern audience who's familiar with the new term, London.
It's almost worse than that because you can actually recognize Londinium and London as being the same place.
Yeah.
But let's take an example of York. The 8th Legion established a camp at York, is what you'll read in all your encyclopedias and on the internet, etc. But of course, it wasn't called York at the time that the Romans settled there. They called it Eboracum. So there's no relationship between Eboracum and York when you look at the actual words, but they're the same place.
So you also talk about the misidentification of Pharaoh Shishak with Shoshenq.
Yes.
Can you go into that a little bit?
That's crucial, really, because what happens is in Egyptian chronology, they actually use the Bible to date the 22nd dynasty, which is one of these dynasties I talked to you about in this Dark Age period. And the first king of that dynasty is called King Shoshenq. Now, in the Bible, we hear about King Rehoboam in his 5th year, that Judah is attacked by this pharaoh called Shishak. And this is about 5 years after Solomon's death. And this Shishak comes along and he plunders the temple of Solomon of its treasures and the palace, and off he goes back to Egypt. Well, Egyptologists, even from the time of Champollion, have equated Shishak with this Shoshenq character, the founder of the 22nd dynasty. When you look at his inscription in Karnak that's based on this identification of the two, they don't relate at all. They're completely different campaigns. The one in Karnak is an assault upon the area of Israel, the northern kingdom, whereas the Shishak description in the Bible is an attack upon Judah. They are completely different. There's no mention of Jerusalem in the inscription at Karnak. And there's no mention of the fortified cities that Rehoboam built to protect his kingdom from an attack from Egypt. None of that's there. So that synchronym is very, very dubious, and yet it's used to date the beginning of the 22nd dynasty, and from there, that's used to date Ramesses II, working back through the kings lists. So you can see that what happens is the Bible is used by Egyptologists to date ancient Egypt, and then the Egyptologists reject the Exodus story and the whole story of the sojourn as a complete myth because they don't find any evidence in the time of Ramesses II. It's a totally circular argument.
Fascinating. So Kenneth Kitchen is a proponent for the later Exodus date in the 1200s or so BC. How do people who follow his view end up explaining a text like 1 Kings 6, which says that the Exodus took place 480 years earlier than the period in which Solomon built the temple?
Right. Now, that's a really interesting question. What you get is a situation where they want to reduce that date by about 200 years. They go to 1250 BC because of this mention of Ramesses in the city of Ramesses in the first chapter of Exodus. So they put everything into this idea it's 1250 BC. So they have to explain how come it says something different in the Bible. And so what they do is they say, oh, well, the Bible was using a 40-year generation. And if you multiply 40 by 12, you get 480 years. And so that's how it works. But we all know it's not 40 years a generation. We think it's much less, maybe 30 years. And therefore, we can put a date at 1250 BC. That's how they do it.
So it's symbolic enumeration, and then they just kind of try to fit that into their historical scheme.
Exactly. But yet in the Judges period, we have a mention of a 300-year period from the conquest through to the time of late Judges. So there you go. You see, there's a confirmation from a different source.
And so if you do take that language from 1 Kings 6 literally, that it's actually 480 years before the time of Solomon's temple, that works with your chronology?
Absolutely. It's around 1446, 1447, which is the date that most people who believe the biblical date would put it in around that time. But a lot of people in evangelical scholarship retain the conventional dating scheme for Egypt. So they end up with a date in the middle of the 18th dynasty for the Exodus, when you have the most powerful pharaohs in Egypt and the richest pharaohs in Egypt, and you don't have any evidence at all of a collapse in Egyptian civilization. Whereas in the new chronology, where you shorten the whole thing by 300 years, you're then bringing it into the context of the 13th dynasty, where there is a massive collapse, and we have the invasion of the Hyksos coming into Egypt, and Egypt is itself enslaved for about 150 years. So that matches much better the story of the punishment of Egypt by God when the Israelites leave Egypt after the Exodus.
Yeah. Talk to our listeners for a minute about the Egyptian historian Manetho, whose words were preserved for us by Josephus. What does he say that's relevant to this discussion?
What he says in a very, very famous passage, and don't forget that he's an Egyptian priest, so he's writing from an Egyptian perspective, but he's writing in Greek because his masters are the Greek pharaohs living in Alexandria. So he's writing in Greek, and he says basically that God in the singular, right, not the gods of Egypt, but God smote the Egyptians. And then immediately afterwards, these foreigners, these Hyksos kings, came into Egypt and invaded the place and didn't even have to strike a blow. Why? Because the Egyptian army had been destroyed. That's the only conclusion you can come to. So we have a smiting of the Egyptians by God, and then shortly afterwards, we have an invasion of these foreigners that come into Egypt, and there's no Egyptian army to defend the country. So what I do is I say, well, that sounds like the Exodus to me.
And the name of the pharaoh that's recorded in that context is Ptolemaeus?
Yes, Josephus records it as Ptolemaeus because it's Greek, remember? Mm-hmm. But when you translate that back into Egyptian, the name is Dudimosa.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the name Moses in that name. So what we have here is the very, very first use of that term Moses in a name is Dudimos. We have no Moses before that, apart from this king. And that's exactly the time we put Moses as well.
And when is Dudimos reigning as pharaoh over Egypt?
Right at the end of the 13th dynasty. So in the revised chronology, that would be around 1447, 1446 BC. And then when we go a little bit further back in history, we get to the writings of Artapanos, who was a Jewish historian, and he mentions the name of the pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace as a prince of Egypt. He calls him Kenopheres. Now, we know who Kenopheres is because there's one unique pharaoh in the entire history of Egypt with that name, and it's called Khenepheres Sobekotep IV. So we can date him, and he's just about 80 years or so before when God smites the Egyptians and the whole civilization collapses.
Now, tell our listeners about the work of Manfred Bitak and some of the things he discovered at the archaeological dig site at Tel Adaba.
Right. Well, this is the location of both Ramesses, the city of Ramesses, and also this earlier city, which is underneath it, called Avaris. So Manfred Bitak is digging the city of Avaris. And in this place called Tel Adaba, he was excavating there from the 1960s, and he found this huge population of Semitic peoples living there. It starts in the very first phase as a small village, maybe 70 to 100 people, centered around one particular house. And this house, the Germans and Austrians call it a middle room house. And it's very, very typical of northern Syria, this type of design. Now, where did Abraham come from? He came from northern Syria. So his descendants, including Jacob, would probably, when they settled in Egypt, would have built a similar type of house. And then these other houses were built around it, as I say, about 70 to 100 people. And then it rapidly expands over a period of maybe 60 to 100 years. This small settlement becomes a huge city of Semitic peoples, which again is very much like what the story of the Bible is. So we get this idea of the people coming in with Jacob in the famine, small group of people, and then it expands exponentially. They become wealthy, and it then becomes a threat to the Egyptian state. And that's when the enslavement period starts, when the Egyptians decide they're too big a threat, these people, we have to enslave them.
What evidence, other than the style of the house, do we have that this is a community of Semites?
We have their graves. And those graves show us that they are Canaanites. Their pottery is Canaanite that we find that it's not Egyptian. The way they're buried, they're laid on their side. They're not laid on their backs like Egyptians would be, in a semi-fetal position, which is very typical of Canaanite burials. Some of the chieftain figures who were buried at this site over a period of maybe a couple of 100 years, they were buried with slain donkeys in a pit in front of their tombs, plus a couple of sheep. Now, when the sheep were analyzed, they were found to be North Syrian type of sheep, which are typical of the area, again, from Haran. So they brought their sheep with them down from the north into Egypt. And these are the first sheep we find in Egypt. We don't find the Egyptians normally having flocks of sheep. These are the first ones to appear in Egypt. So we know they are what we call Western Asiatics. That's the term that archaeology uses. This is the first time we see a large population of Western Asiatics or Semites in Egypt in the Middle Bronze Age.
So why, if there seems to be such a clear synchronicity between what you're finding in the archaeology and the Bible, then why isn't this something that Manfred Betak himself has pointed out?
It's very simple, because he accepts the late date for the Exodus, the Ramesses Exodus date at around 1250 BC. So if you then project backwards in time, these people are much too early for him. They cannot be the Israelites, because he wants the Israelites to be there in the New Kingdom period before Ramesses.
Yeah, so it goes back to the chronology.
Exactly. So if we take the 300 years out that I've suggested from Egyptian history, that pulls the date of these Semites in Avaris right up to the time when Joseph and Moses would have been there.
The Humble Skeptic is a listener-supported podcast brought to you by the generous support of our donors and subscribers. If you have benefited from this program and would like to see it grow, please consider making a one-time gift or becoming a paid subscriber. All our donors and subscribers receive complete access to the archive, along with additional bonus content, such as the forthcoming PDF resource that I'll be releasing soon related to the Book of Revelation. For more information, simply click on the Donate tab at humbleskeptic.com. That's humbleskeptic.com. I was reading an article in Archaeology magazine just a little over a year ago that featured this story of the findings there at Tel Adaba, and Manfred Betak was quoted as saying, "It wasn't an invasion. We have no doubt that it was a gradual infiltration. These Syrio-Palestinians moved into Egypt in exchange for something to eat, and this local population hub, mainly of people from the Levant, blossomed with the blessings of the pharaohs." Does seem to be a pretty nice match, doesn't it?
It does, exactly. His problem is that he thinks these people who came in at the end of the 12th dynasty, who settled there, as you say, in times of famine probably, he thinks these are the early Hyksos, the invaders. They're not. Josephus makes it very clear, Manetho makes it very clear that the Hyksos came in as a marauding horde, with chariots and horses, and they invaded the place after Egypt had collapsed, after God had smote the Egyptians. That's later. So what he's not understanding is you have to distinguish between the Semitic peoples who come in at the end of the 12th dynasty, who are the Israelites and Hebrews, and those people who invade Egypt after the Exodus, when the Israelites have left and moved into Sinai.
Would you say that the Hyksos would be Canaanite, but not Hebrews?
Absolutely. Well, now that's a difficult problem, because what are Hebrews? Israelites are Hebrews, but not all Hebrews are Israelites.
Yeah.
Okay, so Israelites are specifically the descendants of Jacob,
who's named Israel.
Yes, so we have to distinguish between the two. So who are these people who are coming in when the Exodus leave? The Bible tells us who they are. They're the Amalekites. The Bible says when the Israelites are leaving Egypt, they meet the Amalekites in Sinai, and they have a battle, the first great battle of the Exodus and the conquest. So these people, the Amalekites, are the people who are coming into Egypt. They're coming in the opposite direction of the Israelites who are leaving, and they find that there's no Egyptian army there to defend the country, and they take it over. And the name that they're given in the classical text is the word Hyksos. It means rulers of foreign lands, but it also could also mean rulers of shepherds, Hekashasu. And shepherds, of course, are people like the Amalekites.
Now, later on the site of that initial four-room house, you point out that a great palace was later constructed. Talk about that.
Yes. Well, if we take the story on a little bit, we know the story is all about the great famine that occurs in Egypt in this particular period, the time of Jacob's arrival in Egypt. He comes into Egypt in the second year of the famine. And of course, the person who he's come to see there is Joseph, who is now the great leader of the country, second only to the Pharaoh. And he's the one building the granaries and preparing for this famine, storing the grain, taking the fields and the land from the rich nobles, putting it into government hands, very typical of what we find in the story in the book of Genesis. This is all happening at this time. We do have a big famine at this time. So obviously the story finishes when the famine finishes. The last thing we hear about in Joseph is when he's on his deathbed. What happens in between the famine and his deathbed is Joseph being the vizier or the leader in the land, the administrator in the land. And of course, he's going to get a palace built for him. He's not going to live in a hovel. Pharaoh is going to build him a grand palace. And that is what we find immediately on top of this Syrian house, which is Jacob's house, I believe. When Jacob dies, the house is demolished and a palace is built on top of it. And I think this is the palace of Joseph. It's an Egyptian-style palace, but the occupant was not Egyptian. We know that from the graves that surround the palace. We know that from the tomb of the owner of the palace, that he was a Western Asiatic, a Semite. So although it's an Egyptian high official, the person was a foreigner. He was not Egyptian.
And you say that his tomb was actually in the shape of a large pyramid. Do we have any other pyramid tombs for anyone other than the pharaohs?
Not at this time, no. Much later in the New Kingdom we do. We have pyramid-shaped tombs. It's not a massive pyramid. It's not like the great pyramids of the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, the stone ones. This is a mud brick pyramid. And the actual burial is underneath the pyramid. It's not inside the pyramid. It's below the pyramid. But what's fascinating about this particular pyramid is it had a chapel on the front of it. Now, that's not normal. And in this chapel, they found the smashed remains of a statue, which has been reconstructed. Now, that statue is fascinating because of what it looks like. It's a very unusual statue. It's not Egyptian this time. It's an Egyptian-style statue, but the person himself is not Egyptian.
And it's a large statue, right? How big would you say it is?
It's twice life size, but because it's a seated figure, it doesn't go to twice your normal standing height. It will be about a third higher than your normal standing height.
Yeah. So obviously this pyramid tomb seems to be representing a notable Egyptian official, and yet you say that the hairstyle and the skin tone reveal that he was a foreigner.
And the coat that he's wearing as well, because we have remains of paint on the statue. Now, what remains of the statue is just basically the head and the shoulders. The rest of it has been smashed and taken away. The statue was very badly damaged. It was actually attacked with an axe, so the head is partially smashed. The front of the face is smashed off. The body of the actual statue was carted off and used somewhere else. We've never found it. It's been used in a building somewhere else, on a mosque or something in the Islamic period. Who knows where it is? But what we have left is this head and the shoulders. Now, one of the things about the shoulders is that he has a scepter of office across his left shoulder, which is actually a throw stick. And a throw stick is the sign the Egyptians use for a foreigner from Canaan, a Canaanite. It's a throw stick is a symbol of hunting with the throw stick like a boomerang. And it's always used in Egyptian hieroglyphs to represent a foreigner, or what they call Amu, which means Asiatic or somebody from the north. So we have already a symbol there that shows that this guy is not Egyptian. He's a foreigner. When we look at his skin color, what the remains of the paint we have over on the forehead is yellow. He's not dark skinned, brown, like you would expect an Egyptian to be. He's actually pale yellow skinned. And we have the remains of fragments of paint to show that. And his hair is remarkable. It's mushroom shaped. And the remains of the paint there are flame red. So he had flame red hair, yellow skin, and he carried a throw stick, which is a symbol of a foreigner, a Semite, on his shoulder. And then when we look at the back of the statue on the shoulders, we have remains of paint there of stripes. And those stripes are in possibly red, black, and white, the colors that we typically see for Asiatics of the Middle Bronze Age period. They have multicolored coats, and this guy was wearing a multicolored coat. Think about it. What is the thing we most remember about Joseph? It's his multicolored coat. Yeah. Why wouldn't he have that representing him on his statue? Why wouldn't he have more multicolored coats made for him when he was the high official, the vizier of Egypt? He could afford to do that. It's what we remember about him, and it's what he wanted to be remembered by.
Were Egyptians ever depicted wearing multicolored coats?
No, not like these at all. The Egyptians tended to wear white with trim on their sleeves and on around their necks. This is a coat made of multicolored stripes. It's a coat of many colors.
But you do point out that there is a cave discovered, I think it's called the Beni Hassan cave, which depicts Canaanites wearing multicolored coats. Talk about that.
Yeah, sure. This is a tomb of one of the nomarchs or local leaders, regional leaders, who were very powerful at this time, depicting the arrival of Asiatics in Egypt, almost like the story of the Midianites bringing Joseph into Egypt. What we find there is we have a train of foreigners, Asiatics, coming into Egypt, selling eye color, basically, at kohol. And they're coming in, there's 37 of them, and the men are all wearing multicolored coats. The chieftain figure who's leading them has a very, very elaborate multicolored coat. And this is the only time in Egyptian history that we have depictions in the art of this type of multicolored coat the foreigners are wearing. It doesn't happen later and it doesn't happen earlier. But it is one generation before the time I would place Joseph.
Which would basically indicate that at the very time that's reported in Genesis, the kind of amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat just so happens to be,
yes,
according to the archaeology of the period, the kind of garment that was in style among the Canaanites and exclusively among the Canaanites.
Exactly. And it was prestigious. The grander the coat, the more prestigious the individual. So when this special coat was given to Joseph by Jacob, the rest of his brothers get jealous because this was a fabulous one, like the chieftain we find in this nomarch's tomb, as opposed to the rest of the men who are following him behind. They've got less elaborate coats, less ornate coats. So it's a status symbol, and that is why the brothers were so jealous of it.
So this particular colossal statue, as you point out, has numerous indications that it's a foreign ruling official.
Yes.
Are there any other viziers or prime ministers, governors, which we've discovered that are shown to be foreigners holding that important office?
Well, we know that when this village is founded at Avaris, it's only after that we start to see high officials with Semitic names. So this village is formed at the end of the 12th dynasty. We would put Jacob and Joseph in that period there. But of course, Joseph continued after Jacob dies to rule in Egypt as the vizier for a long period of time. So that takes us well into the 13th dynasty. And we start to see at the time when he is in power, we start to see Semitic pharaohs and Semitic high officials running the country. And the native Egyptians are less powerful in this period.
Now, when Manfred Bietek and his team excavated the burial chamber of that pyramid tomb, they discovered that a hole had been dug into it and its contents removed. Why do you think that's significant?
Well, think of the story. When the Exodus takes place, Moses has to remove the body of Joseph to fulfill the promise that Joseph should be taken to the promised land when the Exodus occurs. So the Israelites had to remove the body from his tomb. So here we have this pyramid tomb with a grand palace right next to the river, and we have a hole dug from the chapel where the smashed statue was located down into the tomb beneath the pyramid. And when the archaeologists actually excavated the burial chamber itself, they found no remains of any body, no bones. The actual burial chamber floor was completely clean. There's no pottery, there's no beads, there's no anything that you would expect to find from a tomb or a burial. The question is, of course, if this was tomb robbery, if somebody had come along and decided to rob the tomb, why would they take the bones out of it? The bones are of no value at all. So what we have is a cleaned out tomb. The body's disappeared, the coffin in which it was contained has disappeared, and then afterwards somebody comes along and smashes this statue to smithereens. I'm saying this is the Egyptians coming to take revenge on the person who brought these Asiatics, these Semites, into Egypt in the first place, and has caused this disaster we call the Exodus with all the plagues.
Is there any way to tell approximately when that hole was dug?
Impossible. What we do know is that it was covered over by the later strata, so the Hyksos period is above that. So it must have occurred before the Hyksos arrived.
Okay.
So we're talking about after the 13th dynasty, yes? So we would place the Exodus sometime in the late 13th dynasty, then the arrival of the Hyksos after that. The pyramid itself was demolished, so all the debris from that would have been piled on top of this original tunnel that was dug, covering over the statue, covering over the chapel, and then more graves were placed above it, which then interloped, if you like, bits and remains of them into the upper part of the original level where the tomb was located.
Now, according to Genesis 41:45, Pharaoh gave Joseph the Egyptian name Zaphanath-Paneah, which in the original Hebrew was probably closer to Zaphnath-Paneach.
That's correct.
So do we have any evidence for an Egyptian vizier by that name in any texts or inscriptions outside of the Bible?
Okay, so what the first thing I have to do is separate those two names. Zaphanath is actually a corrupted version of Egyptian Zatenath. which means he who is called. And what we find is Egyptian papyri at this time, when they have slave lists, they have a Semitic name, and then he who is called and their Egyptian name. So they're given, these Semites are given an Egyptian name. So this he who is called is Zatanaf. Okay, so the first part simply means he who is called. Now, Anea is the actual pronunciation of what we call Ankh today, the sign of life, the symbol of life. The modern Egyptologists call it Ankh, but actually it was pronounced Anech. That has been understood by Kenneth Kitchen and other scholars to mean the one who is called Apaneo, which means the one who lives. When Jacob comes into Egypt and finds his son is still alive, Pharaoh looks at this and says, oh, look, the boy is still alive. And so he names him and gives him an Egyptian name, which is Apaneo or Apiank, which means the one who lives. So remember the story of Joseph and Jacob coming into Egypt and finding that his son, who he'd thought been killed by a beast in the fields, was still alive and was the great high official of Egypt. So Pharaoh, what does he do? He gives Joseph a very, very nice Egyptian name. He was called the one who lives.
So basically, in Egyptian, his name would be sort of close to the way J.K. Rowling first described Harry Potter as the boy who lived.
Yes, exactly correct. What a good parallel that is. Very good. Excellent. I like that. So it's not difficult to understand that Zaphanat and Zatanaf are the same. You've got a metathesis there of the P or the F and the T. They're swapped around. We have that all the time in ancient languages, especially with foreign languages transferred into another language. So in the Bible, for instance, we have quite a good few examples of that. So once you've got he who is called, if we look at the name Aneach, that actually is an Egyptian, modern Egyptian parlance, how we would pronounce it today, would be Anku. That's how we modern, but Aneachu or Neach would be the way it was really pronounced. Now, Anku was the greatest vizier of the 13th dynasty, late 12th dynasty, 13th dynasty. The granary stores all over Egypt are called the granary stores of Anku.
Wow.
So that again matches the story of Joseph, because he was the one who built the grain stores in the time before the famine. So they're named after him. Many of the slave lists have named children named after Anku. So they're actually called Anku this or Anku that. So he was a very, very powerful vizier of the time. And we reckon that he is the guy who was the Egyptian version of the biblical Joseph. In other words, he'd been given his Egyptian name and he's referred to in the Egyptian text by his Egyptian name, not by his Hebrew name.
Do we have any records of Anku that links us to any other elements of the Joseph story? For example, Joseph was married to an Asenath. Do we know the name of Anku's wife? Anything about his children?
Unfortunately, we don't know anything about his wife, and you wouldn't expect in Egyptian texts, when you have these official documents, they don't say, and the missus was called so-and-so. So it would be difficult to find things like that. Sometimes we do find it when we have a genealogy, perhaps, of a son who would name his mother and father. But in this case, we don't have that. But what we do know is that Anku was followed by a vizier whose name is very similar to Ephraim. And as you know from the story, Ephraim is chosen to be the senior, although he's the younger son.
Yeah.
He's shown to be the senior one. So it's very possible that this vizier who follows him actually took the job that Joseph had. Once Joseph had died, his son took over, and that would be quite normal in Egyptian society for that to happen. So it is very possible that we have a situation where one of Joseph's sons did continue to be vizier, and this is in the period before all the sons had died. Remember, the story is that the Pharaoh who did not know Joseph comes along with his little dynasty and decides to oppress the Israelites.
In his book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, Douglas Petrovich makes the argument that there's a reference to a person named Asenath in Sinai inscription 376, and that another inscription may refer to Hebrews of Bethel. What are your thoughts about his work?
Okay, this is quite a complex subject area. We're talking about the earliest alphabet invented by humankind. Egyptologists call it Proto-Sinaitic, but it is in fact the first time that anybody in the world uses symbols to create letters to form words. So you construct a word using an alphabet, as opposed to hieroglyphs, which aren't like that. There are many more hieroglyphic signs than the Proto-Sinaitic signs, which are probably about 23 or 26 altogether. So very similar to our own alphabet today. We do agree on when this invention happened. The person who came up with this was in the reign, during the reign of a king called Amenemhat III, who was one of the last kings of the 12th dynasty. Now, he is the Pharaoh Joseph in my chronology. It's not the Pharaoh Joseph in Dog's chronology. I think he moves him back to Senusret III, who was the father of Amenemhat III. However, those two kings actually had a co-regency of 20 years, so they overlapped. Senusret III introduced his son to the throne 20 years before he died himself. So there's a long overlap between the two of them. So we might be talking about the same period, in fact, where this invention takes place. Now, I would accredit Joseph to that post because he was an educated Semite. He was an official administering the land. He would need to send instructions to all the people he was sending out to work the fields, to gather in the grain, to go to the mines in Sinai to bring back copper and also turquoise. He'd have to write notes and messages. He would have to find a way to do that. And so we think he's the best candidate for the inventor of the first human alphabet. So we have a period when we know the alphabet began life, but it then continued all the way through what we would call the 13th dynasty, the period after the 12th dynasty. And then it would probably move across to what we call Proto-Canaanite, which is where we find it in Canaan, in the land of Canaan. Now, in the revised chronology, this would be the time when the Israelites have moved into the Promised Land. Mm-hmm. So they would bring this alphabetic script with them. So it's actually not Proto-Canaanite at all, it's Proto-Hebrew. Okay, and then it evolves into what we would call Paleo-Hebrew, the later form. And they would then give it in the time of Solomon to the Phoenicians. Not that the Hebrews borrowed it from the Phoenicians. They gave it to Hiram of Tyre, and then the Phoenicians gave it to the Greeks. Yeah. And the Greeks gave it to the Romans, and the Romans gave it to us. It's the same alphabet.
Which is why in Hebrew it's Aleph Bet, and in Greek it's Alpha Beta, and we talk about the alphabet.
Absolutely, absolutely. The signs are, you could derive the modern signs through the Greek, through the Phoenician, back to this Proto-Sinaitic. The shapes evolve, but you can identify those shapes in the earliest Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions.
So you agree with Petrovich that Hebrew is the world's oldest alphabet. You just disagree with his translations of some of those inscriptions?
The translations and also the timing as well, because he tends to divide them sharply between the time of Joseph and the time of Moses. And so when he's looking at the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions in Sinai, he's placing them all in the time of Exodus, the time of Moses. Now, that is possible, but we have inscriptions earlier than that in the Wadi el-Hol, which are from the time of Joseph, and they translate in a way that makes them sound like they are criticisms of Joseph by some disgruntled official or laborer, or whatever he is, who's able to scratch an inscription, and he's moaning about this guy all dressed in his finery. I can actually give you a translation if you want it.
Sure.
I've got it on my computer here. And you have to think of it now as being Joseph, okay? This is somebody writing about Joseph. It is too much for us. The taskmaster even conscripts the free man. Now, as you know from the story, Joseph actually forced free men to work in the fields as well as the slaves. The nobles of Egypt were brought to actually gather in the grain and produce the grain for people. So that is a really telling inscription. It's somebody moaning about the fact that the taskmaster, i.e. Joseph, is conscripting even free men to gather in the grain.
And you're translating that, assuming that these characters are actually Paleo-Hebrew?
These characters are Paleo-Hebrew. The Wadi el-Hol inscriptions are the very first evidence we have for this particular alphabet. What I did was I went into Sinai and I actually found many of these inscriptions that originally found by Petrie in 1905, and we checked them. And I contacted a rabbi in Israel who is a specialist, and he's very well versed in ancient biblical Hebrew. And I said, I'm going to give you a set of Proto-Sinaitic letters. I want you to read them, and I want you to tell me what you think they are. And he wrote back to me and said, this is pure biblical Hebrew. I read it instantly. I didn't have any problem in reading it whatsoever. The reason why most conventional scholars say it can't be biblical Hebrew, of course, is this is way before Moses. This is way before Joseph in the conventional dating scheme. So it can't be Hebrew for them, basically. But when we remove that problem of the timeline and we place Joseph and Moses in the 12th and 13th dynasties, this fits perfectly with that. Rabbi Michael Shlomo Bar-Ron's translations, the guy that I asked to look at these inscriptions, are so much more dynamic, so much more related to the biblical story of Exodus. They talk about the problems that the Israelites and the Hebrews had in worshipping old gods. The inscriptions talk about rejecting Baalat, the lady, which is the Semitic version of Hathor. And of course, she is the golden calf.
Right.
So you have these rejections of this worship of this goddess, and you must not talk and you must not speak her name. You must not worship this animal god. And then, of course, later on, you get Jeroboam I, who actually says that it was the cow goddess who actually brought the Israelites out of Egypt. It wasn't Yah or Yahweh, it was this cow goddess. So he's reverting back to these other worshippers who thought that Hathor, the goddess of Sinai, was the one who brought them out of Egypt.
Back to the Joseph story. According to Genesis 41:45, Potipharah, Joseph's father-in-law, was a priest of On. Are there any external references to priests of On?
Well, On, of course, is Ayunu in the Egyptians, or Heliopolis in the Greek. And that was a very, very important city, the city of the sun god, Ra. So, yes, so if we were referring to Heliopolis, that would be the Greek version of the name. On is very close to the Egyptian Ayunu, which is the Egyptian version of the name. So we think it was Heliopolis where this priest would have been. And there would have been a huge priesthood for the worship of Ra, the sun god, in Heliopolis.
Earlier, you mentioned that the pharaoh who elevated Joseph to power in your chronology was Amenemhat III. What do we know about him from history?
Well, he's a very interesting character, actually. He came to the throne very young. His father, as I say, made him a co-regent. So he's actually, for his first 20 years of the reign, he was with his father on the throne. We quite often have co-regencies in this period. And it's about his year 20 or 21 that his father dies, and that is when the famine begins. So the years of plenty are prior to the time when his father dies. And when his father dies, he is then the sole ruler, and it's Joseph who is administering the land, keeping the people alive during the famine period. And it's in his reign that we have evidence of this terrible famine, because way down south in the upper reaches of the Nile, there is a narrowing in the Nile between two fortresses, Semna and Cumma. And on the cliff face next to the Nile are heights of the River Nile marked on the point where the water reached during this particular period for each year of this King Amenemhat's reign. And first of all, they are higher than normal. And then within a period of about 7 to 8 years, they suddenly leap up even higher still to a disastrous level, which would have caused total destruction in Egypt, because the flood would then flowed right the way down into Egypt, flooded the land, washed away all the mud brick houses, killed the cattle, but most of all, drowned the fields for such a long period of time that nobody could have planted any crops in that time when they would normally plant, because the land was still flooded, which would result in year after year of no crops, and that would result in famine. And that happened about year 20 of Amenemhat III.
How would that account for the famine in the land of Canaan, which forces Jacob's family to, look for food?
That is a really interesting and very good question. What we're talking about in modern terms is a shift in the climate zones. Okay, so we have a shift northwards, right? So the tropical zone of the Congo region, the equator region, would move up into Ethiopia. And so you would get far more rain in the Ethiopian highlands that you would normally get. That rain would pour down into the Nile Valley, the Blue Nile and the White Nile, come together and flood Egypt to the north. So the result is excess water creates a famine in Egypt because they can't plant the crops. But the Egyptian climate and the Arabian climate is shifting into Canaan, pushed upwards. And that is a dry climate, Sahara desert climate. So your result in Canaan is lack of water, no rain. So you have that parallel there. You have a drought in the north and you have excess water in the south, which means that the grain can't be grown in Egypt, but the grain can't be grown up in Canaan because there's no rain.
Christianity is not a mere philosophy. It is geared into history. It's integrated with history. And therefore that historical side is immensely important.
That's Oxford mathematician John Lennox.
And when Stephen was hauled before the Sanhedrin in Acts 7 and stood up and made his speech, it was a lesson from history. And what had happened in Jerusalem in the few weeks before was that the nation had rejected Jesus. They did not believe his claim to be Messiah.
Which is what Isaiah said would happen. I mean, he would be despised and rejected by men.
That's right. That's the mystery of the cross, of course, that we see the rejected Son of God, and that is utterly crucial for our salvation. And Stephen said, look, through your history, often you have completely rejected the person that God had raised up to save you. You did it with Joseph. You did it with Moses. And now supremely, you've done it in Jesus. Now, that's one of the ways in which the story of Joseph throws a huge shadow up into the future in the shape of a cross.
If you'd like to listen to my entire conversation with John Lennox about the story of Joseph, you can find a link in the show notes to that episode at humbleskeptic.com. That's humbleskeptic.com. Genesis 37:28 says that Joseph was sold into slavery for 20 shekels of silver. And according to James Hoffmeyer, that actually was the going rate for a slave around the time Joseph would have been alive. But due to inflation, the price increases sometime after that. Is that something you can confirm as well?
Yes, that's true. Kenneth Kitchen was the one who came up with this evidence. Although it's true to say that the 20 shekels would be at a particular time in Egyptian history, it goes back earlier. It actually occurs earlier too. So it actually falls in this period we're talking about, the end of the 12th dynasty. That price would be the correct price. Kitchen has identified that correctly. If we move much further into the timeline, into the New Kingdom and later, the price is more.
Talk for a minute, if you would, about some of the other prominent tombs found in this area of the great palace there at Avaris.
Absolutely. Well, this palace had a garden in the back. And over a period of time, there are 12 major tombs constructed in that garden, one of which is the pyramid tomb, which we would assign to Joseph. Now, the others may well be the tribal chieftains, the other brothers of Joseph. It's a possibility. Intriguingly, there's one joint double tomb from separate periods. They're not all buried together. And it's a joint tomb. And of course, there are two famous brothers of Joseph, the ones who killed all the people in Shechem. We know Levi, and I can't remember who the other one was, but they are described as having very sharp weapons. And what was found in the tomb? Beautiful bronze daggers with ivory handles and gold pommels and beautiful riveted bronze weapons, which are typical of the sort of period we're talking about. So these guys were very much associated with the weaponry that they had in their possession when they were alive.
This Semitic settlement of Avaris grows to become a huge city in a relatively, as you say, at a relatively short amount of time. And according to your research, this settlement became one of the largest cities of the ancient world.
Well, it grew and grew and grew. The statistics we've been given by the Austrian mission, by Manfred Bietak, is around 30,000 people living in this place. Now, that's a huge number. I mean, if you compare it to Jericho, for instance, with 2,000 people, you can see what I'm talking about. However, that 30,000 may not be the point where the Israelites leave Egypt. It may include the Hyksos era that comes afterwards. It's difficult to know what Bietak means there. But what we do know is it was a huge city and it expanded very rapidly. So, and it covered a vast area as well. It's about 2 square kilometers. So it's a huge area.
I read somewhere that even though Manfred Bietak began his excavations back in the 1960s, he's only actually uncovered about 3% of all that could possibly be found there. So is it possible that as we explore the area and do more archaeological investigations over the next 100 years, we'll find that it was even larger?
Well, of course, the problem there is that the excavations have now stopped at Avaris because of political reasons. So nobody's digging there now. And quite often in the situation that arises when you have an archaeological dig is that there might be a 50-year gap between anybody picking up the excavations again later. So at the moment, no more will be found there. However, in the last few years that they were excavating there before the Egyptian government stopped it, they found a huge Hyksos palace. So we know the Hyksos were there as well. They came and moved into the settlement that was the Israelite settlement after the Israelites had left, and they literally bulldozed it and they knocked it flat, demolished all the houses and built huge mortuary temples and funerary temples on the site and a massive Hyksos palace. So, life went on, as it were, and new people came in and redeveloped the site, just as later on Ramesses II redeveloped the site himself.
Yeah. According to the archaeology, though, after that time of expansion, apparently this whole area of Avaris ended up taking a darker turn and things began to decline. Can you go into that?
Yeah, well, what they found in when they examining the graves, first of all, is that the graves early on are quite richly endowed, and the people seem quite healthy. Later on, what happens is when the anthropologists analyze the bones of these people, it's very clear from the way the bones are that they are suffering from malnutrition. Now, when we look at the cemetery evidence, we find that the surviving people, the adults who survived this slaughter, are predominantly female. There's 3 females for every 2 males, which is a skew that you would not normally find. And also, the number of infant burials increases to 50%, whereas normally in a cemetery of this type, it would be about 25%. You can think about what that might be. Well, what about the story of the slaughter of the infant boys that Pharaoh ordered because he wanted female slaves who would do the work but wouldn't challenge him militarily? So he decided to cull the population of male children. So there's a massive increase in the number of infant burials as well. In terms of the houses, again, something interesting happens. The large houses that we find in the early period, in the first phase, that if you like the prosperous phase of the Israelite sojourn, are large, big houses with large courtyards. In the second phase, what we find is lots of much smaller houses. So they're little 2-roomed houses, which suggest again that the population of Semites have suddenly decreased in their wealth and have perhaps become servants.
Interesting.
Because they're attached to larger houses.
Yeah, tell our listeners about the Brooklyn Papyrus as it relates to this period.
Yeah, well, there you go again. Right in the middle of the 13th dynasty, a pharaoh comes along called Sobekotep III, and he's just before this king called Karnefere Sobekotep IV, right? So about 20 years earlier than that, okay? And he is the one who has a papyrus recorded in his time, his name is on the papyrus, of an exchange of slaves from one place to another. And in that list of around 90-odd slaves, at least half of them, and probably more, have Semitic names. And each of the names has got the Semitic name followed by his Egyptian name. So in the Brooklyn Papyrus, we have Semitic slaves. And as I say, the majority of them are Semitic, and a number of them have biblical names.
Yeah, you list Asher, Issachar, Sifra, Menahem. I mean, some of those are the names of the 12 tribes.
Well, not only that, but Zifra was one of the midwives who was ordered to murder the young boys.
What's the traditional date given to the Brooklyn Papyrus?
If you're looking at a conventional date for that, you're probably looking about 1750, something like that.
And your date would be?
We're coming down a bit now. We're talking about maybe 1500, 1540, something like that.
So about 100 years before the Exodus.
Yes. Well, no, I'll revise that slightly. If you take into consideration Moses' life of 80 years before the Exodus takes place, and you then add on the reign of the kings just before Karnefere Sobekotep IV, you're looking at probably about 90 years, 95 years.
Okay. Now, at one point in time, there were a number of hastily dug graves that Manfred Bitak and his team referred to as a plague. And then soon after this, you say the city was abandoned and that the evidence shows that the people just got up and left.
That's exactly as we find it. And again, this is the time I'm talking about when the city is completely abandoned. The Asiatic population disappears, and in come the Hyksos a few years later, maybe a year, maybe 10 years. We're not exactly sure. And they flatten the place and they build a new city on top of it. Okay, so it's just at that point before the city is abandoned where we have these plague pits. They're only about a foot and a half deep. And the body's just tossed in. They're not laid out properly. There's no grave goods with them. There's no real pottery. There's nothing like that. They're just tossed on top of each other, basically. And so that's why Bitak says that something terrible must have happened here, and he thinks it's a plague. Well, it may well be a plague, but we would call it the 10th plague.
Do you know of any other time in Egyptian history when you had such a large number of Semites dwelling in the cities?
Nope, no archaeological evidence whatsoever.
So basically, this is why you would say the best way to match the story of the Bible up with Egyptian history is to rethink the chronology, because if we pay attention, there's a great pattern here if we just have less confidence in the received tradition about the chronology.
Well, yeah, it's a strange thing, isn't it? That, when you try to adjust Egyptian chronology, you get hammered by academics. And when you try to change any thinking about the Bible, you get hammered by the academics. So you're in so a loser when you try to do both at the same time. But I'm trying to be honest, I'm trying to say, well, hang on, look, this is where we see the evidence. Okay. I have evidence in Egyptian history that says we have to shorten the chronology. That happens first. And then when we look back at this evidence we find, this archaeological evidence, it fits in with the dating of Egypt once you revise the timeline. So I have no problem in defending that situation at all. But it is very hard for people to accept this type of thing,
Right.
sadly. But this makes perfect sense. Why not think this way? This is the only time we find this evidence. This is the only time we find all the cities of Canaan being destroyed, like Jericho, etc., etc. But that's all happened much, much earlier, and it can have nothing to do with the Exodus. But when we do look at the Exodus and conquest in the time of Ramesses, we don't find any evidence.
So, in your view, the invasion of the Hyksos into Egypt happens around the same time that the Israelites leave Egypt?
Yes, probably a few years later. I don't know if they came in immediately or whether they came in a year later or 2 years. It's difficult to say. But yes, so you've got the 40 years of wandering, and then their conquest takes place in what we call the Middle Bronze 2B. So we have Middle Bronze 2A is when the Israelites are sojourning in Egypt. The Middle Bronze 2B is when the Hyksos come in and when we have all the destructions in Canaan of the big cities like Jericho, etc. So all the cities that are mentioned in the text of being destroyed are destroyed at this time. So that again fits with the idea of Joshua's conquest after the 40-year sojourn.
I think it was in one of your lectures that I heard you say that there was a scarab that was found in Jericho that referred to one of the Hyksos leaders, and that actually matches up nicely with what you're saying here.
Yes, well, this is the sole scarab that was found in one of the last tombs to be used in Jericho. There was a series of about 5 or 6 tombs where a lot of people died of the plague and were placed together in there. Of course, the story is that there was a plague rife in the region just before Jericho was conquered. And so these are sudden burials that are all placed together. And amongst them, one of them, there was a scarab found, a little tiny scarab that probably was worn around the neck or on maybe even on a ring that's decayed. And it mentioned, or in hieroglyphs, it had the name of a pharaoh called Sheshi on it. Now, Sheshi was one of the first Hyksos kings that invaded Egypt, one of the first group. There was about 5 of them before the big Hyksos kings came along later. So that's right in that 40, 50-year period, immediately after the Israelites leave Egypt. And so we find this pharaoh's name on one of the bodies of the people who died just before Jericho was destroyed. And that fits perfectly with the Hyksos history in Egypt.
And those who have the later date for the Exodus typically end up saying that when the Israelites came into Canaan, all these cities had already been destroyed, and so they ended up developing this as a myth to explain the rubble?
Well, basically that, yes. They basically say they plucked this original event out of there and slammed it into the Bible story. Not that it is the Bible story. It's got to be, it's got to be something else. So all this stuff has been borrowed from history, has been thrown into this mythological text we call the Book of Exodus and Joshua. What a load of nonsense.
James Hoffmeyer over at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School was recently quoted as saying that he thinks that biblical minimalism, or this more skeptical approach in the world of biblical archaeology, is giving way to a more moderate position. Do you think he's right about that?
I think that's right. I think he's right. James is right about that. I mean, he advocates Ramesses' Exodus.
Right.
So that's the time he would put it. But he's a great scholar and he's done some fantastic work. But we happen to disagree about the date of the Exodus, that's all.
Yeah.
But I think that the things that he's found also apply to the earlier date. So I'm happy with that. So I think there are a number of scholars who are coming around to admitting certain things. You have the turn up of the Beit Dud, the House of David in Tel Dan. So new information is coming along all the time as people are being less skeptical, apart from, of course, the absolute minimalists, people like Finkelstein, who I greatly respect as an archaeologist, but I think he's got it plainly wrong.
Has your chronology received any external confirmation from other fields of research?
I think really where we have had some progress is in astronomy, because there are astronomers from America and also from Scotland who have been working on retrocalculating using computer programs the data that we have from the ancient texts in Egypt and elsewhere, who have come up with dates which are extremely compatible with the new chronology and improve greatly on what was done in the past in terms of those dates. So we're getting a 95% success rate with astronomical data using retrocalculation programs.
And then you can match up that astronomical data with historical references to eclipses, etc.?
Eclipses and also lunar month lengths as well, 50 day or 29 days. So you have contracts, for instance, in the Middle Kingdom by particular pharaohs, where they actually give the lunar dates, and they're in a sequence with year dates on them. So you can actually get a sequence of like 20 odd or 30 odd contract dates, which then match a pattern of lunar cycles that you find we're using computer calculation.
So what kind of scholars are coming on board to your new chronology?
Well, they're mainly young. There are lots of researchers, and there are quite a few academics who are in positions now within academia, who were my colleagues at university, who are now in post. And they basically have two different situations. The first is that they are very interested in it. The second thing is that they don't stay there in it. They're not allowed to, because if they do, it threatens their positions, because there's still a whole raft of these other scholars who are there at universities as senior scholars who look at them, and if they start to diverge from accepted wisdom, of course, they would get themselves into trouble.
Right.
So they come along and support me. They come to my lectures, etc. They tell me privately they think it's a well worth investigating. They don't all commit themselves entirely to it, but they think it's fascinating and it's worthy of further research. But they daren't teach it in their classes, and they daren't mention it within academia that they're involved in, the universities that they work in.
Well, you know, when you come up with a new theory, as you mentioned, you're just going to get hammered, particularly by all those who have an investment into the old way of thinking. But since you had so many years in the rock industry, I guess you had a lot of years in experience of being hammered.
Well, yes. I'll tell you something. I used to think that music industry was a pretty rotten industry, but scholarship's much, much worse.
Well, folks, you've been hearing from Dr. David Rohl, author of Exodus, Myth or History, and if you'd like to study this subject further, I'll provide a link to that book in the show notes. While you're there, you can also find links to other interviews I've recorded with Dr. Rohl, in which we discuss possible archaeological discoveries related to Saul and David, as well as another fascinating discussion related to the true location of Jesus' crucifixion. If you'd like to join me for a weekend conference in the Memphis area, I'll be giving a number of talks related to Christ's fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy on April 11th through the 13th, and you can find more information about that in the show notes. Also, on April 24th, I'll be participating in a Christian and Muslim conversation in the St. Louis area with my good friend Michael McClymond of St. Louis University. I'll leave information about that in the show notes as well. And as always, if you're a fan of the show, please share episodes with friends and family and consider making a one-time gift or upgrading to a paid subscription. For more information about anything you've heard on this episode, simply head to humbleskeptic.com. That's humbleskeptic.com. And I look forward to being with you again next time as we discuss the beliefs and ideas that shape our lives.